selected my controller, right? It's got a blue boundary around it. I've selected it, and I went to the attributes inspector, you see, upper right there, and I'm inspecting it. And if you look at the inspector for controller, the top 5 things there are called simulated metrics. And this is a way to simulate your user interface in different orientations or sizes or with tab bars or not, so that you can kind of make sure your UI is working with auto layout. So we're going to go and switch the orientation. All right, so I'm picking on this thing orientation, and I'm switching it to landscape. And when I do that, my scene changes to landscape, and I lost thing 2. Okay, what happened to thing 2? Well, thing 2 is actually there. I left it there. It's kind of grayed out. You see it, but it's not on screen because unfortunately in landscape it doesn't go down far enough to reach thing 2. Okay, so I'm going to switch back. By the way, you notice that the orientation there's portrait and landscape, and there's also inferred. Okay, for all of these things where you change the bounds of your scene, inferred means inferred from what's going on in your storyboard. So if this is the thing that makes a bar come across the top if this scene is in a navigation controller, or a bar across the bottom if this scene is in a tab bar controller, okay? Portrait is the default inferred orientation. So if you pick inferred, just like you pick inferred for the other things, it will infer that you mean portrait. So whether you say portrait, landscape, portrait or inferred are the same for orientation. Landscape means landscape. So let's go back to inferred or to portrait. We get thing 2 back. Okay, thing 2 didn't go anywhere. It was there before, it just wasn't on screen. So I want to put thing 1 and thing 2 in better places. They're kind of in random places. I want to put them in places where I can have a rule that says where they are. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put thing 1 in the upper left corner, and I'm going to put thing 2 in the lower right corner. And I always want thing 1 and thing 2 to stay in those corners, no matter where those corners move. Okay? If those corners move up in a landscape or down because it's an iPhone, the tall iPhone, like an iPhone 5, or up or whatever, I want those things to stick to their corners. So the rules I want is sticking the corners. Okay, I'm going to show you 3 ways to set rules over the course of this lecture. 3 different ways. The first way you've already been doing unwittingly. Well, not really unwittingly because I've been telling you to do it, which is to use those blue guidelines. Okay? When you drag things around and you let the blue guidelines snap to certain locations, you're basically telling Xcode what you want. So when I drag thing 1 up into this upper left-hand corner and these 2 blue lines appear, it's really telling Xcode, yeah, I want it to be stuck to this line and stuck to this line. In other words, upper left there. And same thing when I do that for thing 2. Okay, I'm kind of telling Xcode. But if I drag these 2 things here and then I switch over to landscape again, I still don't get thing 2. Why not? Okay, I did the blue lines. How come it doesn't work? And the answer is, all the blue lines is telling Xcode what you intend. You still have to ask Xcode, make those rules for me. Make those constraints. Okay? So let's go back to the portrait orientation. And the way you do that is the little buttons at the bottom. You see these buttons at the bottom? Here I'll click on one. Those all have to do with auto layout. Okay? And how are you going to lay out the view? And this one that looked kind of like a TIE fighter, a Star Wars TIE fighter there, that one is kind of for resetting, clearing constraints for the entire view, okay, or for a specific view or number of views that you have selected. So the bottom part of this menu is the entire view. The top part is the same things, but for specific clicked-on views, okay? So we'll go through a few of these things, but one really cool one is reset to suggested constraints, okay? Suggested constraints means Xcode is going to suggest to you the best constraints, the best rules, and it's only going to be very good at that if you use the blue guidelines. Because if you don't use the blue guidelines, it doesn't really know what to suggest. It'll suggest something, but it's not going to be good, as we'll see. But in this case, since both thing 1 and thing 2 clearly have blue guidelines to say where they want to be, when we do reset to suggested constraints, it's going to work. Now, nothing appears to happen, right? I did reset suggested constraints, nothing happens. But something did happen, and we can see that by clicking on thing 1 and going over to the size inspector. Okay, so in the inspector there, I've switched over to size. This thing looks kind of like a ruler. And size inspector has, you know, where the current frame is and all that. But at the bottom, do you see where it says constraints? And I have 2 constraints. My leading space, okay, the reason that says leading space instead of left space is because some languages, leading is on the right. Okay? So Hebrew or languages like that, it's on the right. So you might want your entire user interface oriented towards coming from the right, okay, instead of coming from the left, because all your text is going to be going that way. So you might want all your user interface to flow from that way. So anyway, so leading means whichever leading you're talking about. And I want the leading space to be tied to my super view, the edge of my super view, by some fixed amount. And that fixed amount is default. Default, okay? It's not a magic number, it's default. It's by the system. The system decides what that default amount is. And then you can see my top space is also tied to my super view's top edge with the default space. So those two constraints determine exactly where thing 1's going to be. Now what about thing 1's size? Okay? Is thing 1 always going to be exactly the width it is right now? No. Thing 1, like all labels and buttons, it has what's called an intrinsic size. Okay? That's the size that its text demands that it be. And that could change. If you change the text in thing 1, it needs to be wider or could be shorter if you change it to something shorter. And so it will change its size as you change its text, okay? Because you haven't put a constraint on its size. If you put a constraint on its size, it would then be stuck to that size, and that is bad. We do not put size constraints generally on intrinsically sizable items like labels and buttons. And I'm going to show you, hopefully if we have time in the demo, why that's bad. Okay? So anyway, thing 1 only has those two constraints, but those two constraints completely determine thing 1's location, no matter what the super view does. Same thing with thing 2, bottom space, and the trailing space. Okay? So now let's go look in landscape. I'm going to switch over to landscape and see what happens. And you can see thing 2 sticks to that corner, kind of exactly what we want. Right? And that's because thing 2's position is totally determined by those rules now. Okay? Okay, so let's go back to portrait. So I'm going to put a bad thing in there, okay? So this bad thing is going to show you bad things that can happen. And I tried to put bad thing in the middle, but I didn't use the blue guidelines. That's actually difficult to do, but I did. Okay, I put bad thing in. Also, you notice bad thing size, it's too big for itself. It really doesn't want to be that big. It could be a lot smaller if it was its intrinsic size. So I just dragged it out and moved the sizing handles. It has no constraints because I just dragged it out. Okay, see how its size inspector there says no constraints, right? You have no constraints. So what happens if I tried to ask Xcode, please give me some suggested constraints for bad thing? Remember, I didn't use the blue guidelines when I dragged bad thing out. And notice also I'm using the top half of that menu, which is just for bad thing. Okay, I'm not resetting thing 1 and thing 2, although I could reset in thing 1 and thing 2 all day long because they're always going to reset to the proper constraints because I'm using the suggested constraints for them. But anyway. So I'm just going to reset bad things constraints. And boom, Xcode gives it the old college try, but it's hard, okay? And in fact, look at the constraints it came up with there. Height equals 62, leading space equals 89, trailing space 68. In other words, these are all magic numbers. Okay, this is horrible. These are terrible constraints. Constraints with magic numbers are almost always bad. There's a few cases where they're okay, but it's almost always bad. And in fact, if I go and try and switch to landscape, all those numbers stay exactly the same. Okay, it stays 198 pixels from the top and whatever it was from the left. This is totally not what I want. Okay, I'm trying to put bad thing in the middle. I want it to stay in the middle. That's not even close to being in the middle. So suggested constraints aren't going to work if you don't use the blue guidelines because it's not really sure what you want. Okay, so let's get rid of these constraints. I'm going to go back to that same menu and pick a different item here, which is clear constraints, and that clears all the constraints and goes back to this thing. Notice, by the way, all the constraints draw. You see the blue bars? See them? Every single constraint is drawn. And not only does it draw those constraints, you can click on them and edit them. A lot of the constraints have attributes, which I'm not going to have time to talk about today, unfortunately. But those constraints are first-class objects inside of your storyboard. All right, so we're going to clear those out of there. And let's put in some constraints in a different way. So this is way number 2 to add constraints. Way number 1 was use blue guidelines and say suggested. That's way number 1 to put constraints on. Number 2 is you can use some of these other buttons at the bottom. Like this particular button here is for aligning things. So if you look in this, there's a lot of choices of how to align things. If I selected multiple views, then all those things at the top, like leading edges, trailing edges, top edges, I'd be able to pick those, and I could line up the leading edges or trailing edges or whatever of views, make them line up. Okay, it's just an alignment thing, just like if you're in some drawing program or something. I'm going to pick the bottom two, which lines this thing up with the horizontal center in the super view. So it's going to be centered in my super view, both horizontally and vertically. So I'm going to add two constraints here, one for horizontal, one for vertical. And I could also specify an offset from the center. That's what that 0 is right there that's selected, but I'm going to have it be exactly in the center, so I'm going to say 0. And there's also update frames. You see the update frames at the bottom there, right above where it says add two constraints. That pop up, you can go in there and say, and when you add these constraints, move my view to fit those constraints. But I'm not going to set that because I want to show you what happens if you don't do that. Okay, so let's add these two constraints, horizontal and vertical centering. Okay, there they are. You see them? Align center X to super view, align center Y to super view. Awesome, you can see them. They're there. Notice that they're yellow. Okay, yellow is like a warning. Okay, yellow is not good. Blue is good, yellow not so good. Red is really bad. Okay, sometimes your constraints will be red. That's if they conflict. Like you have two constraints saying do opposite things. And we'll talk about how we resolve all this. So it's yellow. Also, if you look really closely, you see there's a dashed box. Kind of right, it goes right through the word bad over to the thing. You see it right there, dashed box inside of the bigger box. That dashed box, I don't know how well you can see that there. Yeah, you can see it. That dashed box is where your constraints say this thing should be. Okay? In other words, if you just looked at your constraints, where should bad thing be? Well, it should be in that little dashed box. But since we didn't click that thing at the bottom there that said update my frame to where my constraints are, it didn't do it. So bad thing is still where it was. And that's why these are yellow. Okay, how can I know why my constraints are yellow? Well, one place is that little triangle in the upper corner there, the normal triangle where you would look at any other warning in your app. And you can see that it says the frame for bad thing will be different at runtime. That's because at runtime the constraints are going to be applied and it's going to be moved into that little dash box. Okay, another place you can see these warnings if your constraints are yellow is in the document outline. Now, we have not had a chance to talk about the document outline in this class, but there's really not a lot to say about it except for that it's really great. And what is it? It's every single object in your storyboard that matters in an outline form. Okay, so that's all your views, all your gestures, all your constraints, things like layout guides, which we're really not going to have a chance to talk about, but it has to do with the auto layout system as well. Those are all listed in this outline, and what's really cool is you can click on them to select, because sometimes your view is very crowded and it's hard to click on the thing you want, even using the Control-Shift trick that I showed you. And also you can control drag from them. Okay, you can control drag from a gesture, you can control drag from a view. It's a really great place to control drag things from. Okay, it's pro tip number 1. Control drag from document outline. The document outline also will show you all the problems with your auto layout. And you see the tiny little yellow circle up there where it says View Controller Scene at the top of the document outline, and then there's that little yellow circle. I'm going to click on that circle, and it's going to show me all the auto layout problems in this controller, in this scene. And you can see the bad thing, it expects a certain frame, and the actual frame is different. And you see the little triangle there. If I click on that triangle, it will offer to solve the problem for me. Okay? Now, how can it solve the problem? Well, there's a number of ways it could solve the problem. It could change the frame of bad thing to be what the constraints say. That's what update frame is. It could update the constraints instead of being the vertical and horizontal center that I just sent it to. It could set them back to being something that would make, you know, the bad thing's frame work. Or it could try to set it to the suggested constraints, which we already know don't work. So we definitely want update frame in this case. Okay, we know we like our constraints. That's the horizontal vertical centering. So we're going to pick that. So I'm going to leave update frame suggested and click where it says fix misplacement. And watch what's going to happen to bad thing. It moved. Okay, now everything is no longer yellow. Bad thing's frame has been set to